Okay.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first talk of the Nightlight Spring Speaker Series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Delia, Acyuta's assistant, and I will be hosting this season's speaker series while Acyuta is away on a trip. So a few words about the Nightlight Speaker Series. For more than 10 years now, Nightlight Astrology has hosted 12 guest speakers on the year, 3 per zodiacal season. And the purpose of these talks is twofold. First of all, it's to expose Acyuta students to different voices and topics beyond what is covered in his classes. And the second purpose, just as important, is also to make quality astrological education more accessible to the public at large. And this is by virtue of making these talks completely free and open to the public. Years back, these talks were donation-based, but we want to especially thank everybody who contributed to the most recent Nightlight Kickstarter campaign, since the success of that fundraiser allows us to guarantee our speakers a generous speaker's fee. And before I introduce today's guest, who will be kicking off our spring series of talks, I would like to show you the full lineup for this season. So if you just give me a moment. This is our website, nightlightastrology.com. If you go to events and speaker series, you will be able to see the lineups for the talks each season, as well as register if you haven't already for the other talks. Today, we are so happy to have Martien Hermes, who will be giving a talk on Hellenistic aspect doctrines, and I will say more about our guest in just a moment. And then next weekend, we are happy to have Ren Butler giving a talk on archetypal astrology. That's going to be Saturday, March 26th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register here to attend live. And then next Sunday, March 27th, also at noon Eastern Time, Jen Zart will be coming on to give a talk on astrology rocks, the relationship between astrology and gemstones, which also should be really interesting. And the replay of all of these talks will be available right here on the Nightlights events page for 7 days after each talk, beginning on the Monday after the talk. So if you can't make it to any of them, if you need to leave early, just go back to this page the next Monday and you will find the talks there. So let me say a little bit more about Martien. So this is Martien's biography. In 1983, I started studying astrology. I'm a qualified Dutch astrologer who's been teaching astrology since 1985. Since 1986, I was extensively involved with Freudian and Jungian psychology and co-counseling and its application in astrological practice. Since 1994, I've been researching traditional astrological sources, and I regularly lecture and do workshops on the insights from this field of knowledge. I studied Robert Zoller's course on medieval astrology, and since 2003, I started studying the work of Robert Schmidt, the man who restored Hellenistic astrology and put it on the map. My astrology was never the same after that. It dealt mainly with the positioning of astrology as a discipline within the concepts of destiny, and conversely, the positioning of the concepts of destiny within astrology. That eventually became the content of the Dutch book, Moving and Being Moved, The Return of Fate in Astrology, about which a colleague wrote. Earlier, I already wrote that this is one of the most important astrological books which have been published in the Netherlands. I still support this claim, and that book has already been translated to French. And Martien, I hope that we will be getting an English translation at some point.
Would be nice, yeah.
So a few words about the logistics of this talk. The chat box is going to be turned off during the talk for the purpose of avoiding distractions. And there will be a Q&A section after the talk. Is that correct, Martien? We're saving Q&A questions until the end?
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay, and so you can type questions about the presentation into the Zoom Q&A box and we'll get it at the end. Oh, that's embarrassing. Oh, no. Okay, I just realized there was something flubbed up with my screen sharing. Martien, is the website on the screen now?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. So once again, nightlightastrology.com, events, speaker series. And this is where you can see all of the talks, the dates, the descriptions of the talks and biographies and register. And this is where you'll see the replay. Okay, well, you guys have caught me. I do still need my notes in order to not trip up. But there we go. All right, so Martien has been a guest several times already at Nightlight for the Speaker Series talks. His talks are always extremely interesting, informative, and very full of detail. And I'm very excited to see what he has to teach us today about the aspects. So without further ado, Martien, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Nice to meet people again here. I'm just having to see which one I need to share. I believe it's this one. Yes, there we are. This. See, yeah, this is fine. Thank you. Okay. Okay, this is good. So again, welcome. Thank you for having me back here at the important webinars series that Acyuta organizes, and I hope you will enjoy this one. It's a pretty hefty topic, Hellenistic aspect doctrine, which I will be addressing via the ideas of configurations, testimony, and aspects. So this is what I will be talking about in the coming hour, 2 hours, I think. So first I will deal with some preliminaries. You will see what they are. The Hellenistic ideas and concepts as opposed to the modern understanding of aspect doctrine, because there are some differences which needs to be taken into account. Then there are two very important major concepts which have to do with assuming a figure and engaging in a figure, which is something quite different. The fourth topic is maltreatment, which I will be addressing with an example chart of somebody who I think everybody knows. She's not alive anymore, but people know about her the world over, I think, so that's going to be interesting. And the fifth topic I will be addressing is that configurations can be an instrument that helps select certain significations attributed to the planets. So here on my sources, you can read about them when you have access to the specific sources that are available on the web, which are unfortunately not many, but I know that there is now a website where you can subscribe to, and then you can listen to Schmidt talking about all the different topics. And whenever you do that, you will understand that this is a big brain, really committed to trying to understand what the Hellenistic astrologers were actually doing. And I hope that this talk will help you understand some of the important concepts, and they will hopefully give you a different view of what is now going on with aspect theory and configurations and such. So let's dive into them. Okay, so I will start with some preliminaries, and one of the more important ones is our 5 Hellenistic delineation principles. The first one is, of course, and these are simple steps to try to understand and can help you delineate charts and planetary positions by means of certain principles used in Hellenistic astrology. Well, the first one is, of course, that we start often with planets, and planets have certain significations, so they can be indicators of specific topics by means of their own significations, but also perhaps being the ruler of a certain place in a chart, which we now call houses. So they do something in a specific way. So that's the manner, the how of a planet. The second important doctrine is that the question with what is the planet actually doing something? And that's often with its dispositor, which we have understood to be the host of the planet visiting in the domicile of the said planet. So planets are doing something with other planets, but the first take on this is not perhaps by configuration and aspects, but it has to do with the dispositor of the planet, which is in a certain image and the representative of a certain place that it rules. And ruling is not perhaps the right term, it's more the manager of a certain place, one of the 12 places. The next question is, where is the planet doing all this, working, having significations, doing something and doing something with its dispositor? Well, it's doing something in one of the 12 places of the chart, and these are really the basics. And then the question is, under what conditions is the planet doing this? And then we come to the topics of dignity, configuration, and aspects, the topic which I will be addressing in this talk. And actually there's a fifth one, which is the question, when is the planet doing this? And that has to do with specific timing techniques and periods, chronocritus, as they are called in the Hellenistic text, the Greek texts, what we now call prognosis. We try to understand when is a planet active and what is it doing when it's active. So that's the principal issue of addressing what do we see and how do we approach a chart whenever we try to do Hellenistic delineation. So, okay. Now, as a preliminary, I will not be talking about all these different things, because here you see how many of the 30 aphorisms that were attributed to Antiochus of Athens have to do with things relating to aspects and testimony and configurations. And this is what Schmidt was working on in this book, and it took him 5 years to even get to try to understand what these different definitions actually meant, because they were hellishly difficult to translate, and more difficult even to try to understand what are they trying to say here, what are they about. And some of them are pretty obvious and some of them are really, really difficult. So if you want to share in his grief, then you must read these books and try to get to grips with whatever there is written in there. But we must also understand that Schmidt really discovered many things having to do with these configurations and why it was such an important development in the astrology of the Greek period. And he was really very admiring of the depth and the subtlety of all these concepts having to do with these aspect and configuration principles. So, but again, I will not be addressing any one of these specifically because that would be really very boring. So what I'll try to do is get to grips with what we can say about all this aspect theory and how in what way it sheds a different light on what we have come to understand as modern astrologers about configurations and aspects. So let's have a look. But first, before I do that, I must address some principles having to do with the difference between the modern understanding of aspect doctrine and the Hellenistic ideas. I need to say first, of course, that Schmidt was of the opinion that the Greek astrology, the early period of this astrology, even though it came after the Babylonian astrology and the Egyptian astrology as such, that the concepts that were conceived in this astrology really are still the bread and butter of modern astrology and are actually the foundations of the Western tradition. So it's quite important to get to know them, because then you really can see and understand specific things about this theory, which is very quite deep, I think. And Schmidt always said that this was one of the most brilliant things that he ever came across, because it's such such an intricate way and so connected and so deep, and also very Platonic in its origin. So he was a big fan, and so am I. So let's have a look at some modern principles, which I can oppose actually to the traditional ones. Now, the modern idea of aspect is actually that they are a principle of movement of the planets, which is of course something that has to do with aspect and configurations, and they are portionally based on the degree position of the planets. It's not quite the take on aspects as presented to us in the Greek texts, because here you can see that aspects in the ancient texts are mediated by the images. So the images are really the base of what we now call the sextile, the square and the trigonal triangular relations between planets. But that simply means that when they are in certain images, then they have these relations to each other simply by being in a specific image. And the proof of that, according to Schmidt, is this. The definition goes like this. I will only read one of them. For instance, the diametrical figure is at an interval of 7 signs, images, with 5 signs between the pair. And the interesting thing is that the interval of 1 or more signs between the pair in question is actually very much stressed here. So this is the reason why Schmidt said, well, the aspect configurations are actually mediated by the images. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that from, I believe, the Renaissance on, there were many aspects added to what we now know as the usual aspects, the often called also the Ptolemaic aspects. So we have a host of minor aspects, the quincunx and the semi-this, the semi-that, the serpentile, and the imbecile is not really a minor aspect, but it's my attempt at being funny. But yeah, there are so many of them, and it's really important to try to understand what people try to say with them. And in traditional astrology, the language was much more simple, I think, in this regard. So I'm not saying that they should be avoided, but there are some things that can really be said about them which are not quite in line with the traditional idea of what aspects and configurations actually are. So here you see them, a lot of them. Everything in a chart can actually be connected to each other, and that really messes up things sometimes really horribly, so that you don't really understand what's actually going on between these planets. So in traditional astrology, there are only 7 rays. So from each position that a planet can have, it can have has 7 rays going on for it, which are, of course, the hexagonal one, the sextile, the square, the trine, and the opposition, and they go both ways. So in total, we have, you could say we have perhaps 7 rays only, and differentiated between one coming down and one moving away from the center. So 7 rays. So that's also something difficult, different. One of the modern notions is also that applying and separating is aspect doctrine, which is not quite true. Applying and separating is flowing forth and dropping off in the ancient terminology, and which that is a completely different concept from the image-based rationale of configuration and aspect. So there's a difference between these things, and they need to be separated. I have an example of flowing forth and dropping off, and especially the applying figures I will show you in a minute. In modern astrology, there is the use of orbs. The difference the question is, when are planets actually in a degree-based aspect? And there you have many different ones. And when you are into Renaissance astrology, then you get these sort of images and these sort of orbs for planets. And as compared to a traditional Greek orbs between planets whenever they are aspecting each other. That is quite different. That is simply one of 3 portions and 12 to 13 for the moon. So when planets are configured in this way, so the distance between them is less than 3 portions, and for the moon that's 12 to 13 portions, then you can say they are in aspect, and the rest is configuration. I will show you in a minute how this is functioning in a chart with an example. Okay, another modern notion is that the faster planet is making or doing the aspect and is influenced by the slower planet, which is not quite at odds with the ancient idea, but the ancient way is that that configurations also always go both ways. So I will explain what configuration then actually is all about in a chart, but they do it with each other, and only when there is maltreatment and bonification conditions, then you can say that one planet is doing something to another planet. So I will get into the idea of maltreatment as well further on with an example chart. Okay, so another idea is that aspects and configurations are actually sort of mixing energies of the planets. So you get A plus B delivers something like a C delineation, and C also depends on the type of aspects. And this is perhaps the greatest difference between modern notions of configurations and aspects as opposed to the ancient one, because the ancient one has to do with planets testifying to each other. The concept of seeing, the Latin word is aspectus, meaning looking at, implies the principle of witnessing, seeing something. And you can only be a witness to something when you have seen it. So the planets testify to each other about each other. And again, the exception is whenever they are maltreating or bonifying in a bonifying condition or a maltreating condition. So this is actually the biggest difference between the modern and ancient notions of testimony and aspect. So, so just for your consideration, beware of the differences between them, because they are very important differences and they have different concepts behind them. So I will explain to you what they are. So, okay. So to recapitulate, there are different names for them. The sextile is called a hexagonal relation between planets. You have a tetragonal one, a trigonal one, or a diametrical one, which are these normal aspects. So it's, yeah, okay. I will not go into the differences about calling something a square, because it's a square picture in the chart when you connect the images that are square to each other, but the Greek terminology is different from that. But okay, so there are different concepts behind them, like these. So again, this is recapitulating, how do you call it? Putting it all in a row. So configurations, remember, are sign-based, and aspects is anything 3 portions apart. Okay, so, and aspects can be either forming or flowing forth, which is within 3 portions, or breaking off when 2 planets are further away than 3 portions, and the faster one is moving away from the slower one. And nowadays, these are called application and separation, and that's okay to call this application or separation, but please understand that these are 2 different concepts behind it. Okay. So let's have a look at the etymology. As I said, aspectus, the Latin is having to do with the words seeing and looking. And Porphyry said they call the figural assumptions, schematismos of the stars in relation to each other. They call them testimonies, with the Greek word epimartyria. And the interesting thing is that martyrio has as its root the word martyr, which means a witness, but also a martyr, somebody who is willing to risk his life to pay testimony to something, which is really really a very interesting and also a quite definitive way of testifying to something by losing your life for it. So that's quite something. Planets in inversion, that's a very important thing as well. People try to connect planets being in inversion and describing all sorts of interesting delineations for them. But in the Hellenistic astrology, it simply means that they cannot see each other. So they can also not testify to each other, because when you see something, you can be a witness. And when you cannot see it, you're either lying or you're an unreliable witness because you just didn't see it. You were not a witness to it. So the question is to see or not to see. And the interesting thing is that the difference between harmful connections and positive connections has to do with this looking. So you got the look, you can see in these first two images, the way one person is looked at by the other one is very threatening and menacing. And that has to do with the way that these planets can look at each other. So there's a menacing look and there's a loving look, as you can see in the other pictures. And this is probably based and has something to do with the idea of the evil eye. People can get hurt by being looked at in a very harmful way or a very aggressive way or whatever. And you can be healed by somebody looking at you in a very loving way. So this is the principle of this looking and this seeing. So that's a very important concept behind it. So please understand that this is what's happening when planets are configured to each other, with each other. So the one is looking at the other, and the question is it a menacing look or is it a loving look? So that's very important as a concept behind this. Okay. Again, these are principles we need to know about. They are somewhat technical, but I need to address them so you can understand what I'm going on about. Schmidt, there was a time when it was said that testimony was only applicable whenever the planets being in a sign-based configuration were actually approaching each other. And when they approach each other and the aspect was really concretely formed within these two images, then it was called testimony. And later, as you can read here, Schmidt said, well, whether closing or not or separating, it actually is all testimony. So he came back and he reversed his idea that testimony was only applicable when planets were approaching each other in the configuration situation. So that's not true. He said that it was no longer the case. So he was convinced that this was also called testimony. Then, of course, you need to understand there's also what he called telling testimony. So whenever planets are approaching the 3-portion interval, they are really approaching each other, and then they are doing, how do you call it, having testimony, they testify to each other. But when they are approaching, and they will indeed make the appropriate distance in the images where they are, then you can say that this is telling testimony. So there's a difference between simply testimony and telling testimonies. It's more specific, I think. So what we now call close scrutiny or very focused attention. You are observing attentively, you are investigating, you're actually staring. And again, you can see in these pictures, the mode of staring is really really important in understanding how a planet is looked at. Is it with trust? Is it with distrust, etc.? And that's interesting. Okay. Another thing that is quite different between modern notions and the ancient Hellenistic notions is what I call the peak, the happening. So whenever planets are applying in a chart, and this is especially true for all sorts of prognostic methods, for instance, transits, then people are of the opinion that whenever the aspect is exact, platic, or partile, as it is called in ancient medieval literature, then you see an effect of what's happening, what these planets signify in a chart. And after the peak, after they have been in an exact whatever aspect it is. Then they start separating, and then gradually the principle is slacking off, so to speak. And this is often counteracted by the idea that things do not always happen whenever these planets in transits are really exact in aspect. There's often a lot of things going on. So it's really very difficult to have exact moments when things are really exact between planets or whatever. So that's quite different. And it's different from what the traditional Hellenistic Greek astrology is about. So whenever planets really get to the 3 degrees distance, which is actually a trajectory of about 7 degrees, then they are said to be engaged, joined in a figure. So there's an engagement by conjunction, synaphe, and that is called an aspect. And the interesting thing is that the word conjunction is not simply for the planets being in the same image and then having a real bodily conjunction, but it's also with all the other possible aspects between planets. That's also an engagement, and it's also called a conjunction. So when planets are in a square aspect, it's also called a conjunction. They are moving to a synaphe. They are coming into reach of each other. So the principles, so there's no speak. There is speak. They are speaking, they are saying something, but there's no peak. They are aspecting, they are joined, and then they are not testifying. And that's a really important difference, which I will be talking about further on. So in this 7 range portion, 3 degrees approaching the exact figure, and then the 3 degrees moving away from it, that is called, the planets are joined in a configuration. They are, not a configuration, they are joined in an aspect. So when they are approaching that, it's called an aspectual application, and that can be by any sort of aspect, as we now know, except the minor aspects, because they were not used. And then moving away from the planet that is that the planet was joined with, is called disengagement and detachment by flowing forth, which is called aporoia, which is a highly loaded word in Greek philosophy, but that's interesting also. So then we are talking about assuming a figure, which is a configuration, and engaging in a figure, which is an aspect. So, okay. Now I have, I have an example. This is about the chart of Frida Kahlo, which will figure greatly in my webinar now, because there's a very interesting aspect happened in her chart. She's not longer among us. So let's have a look at her chart. So here they are. Here it is, without the modern planets, of course, because this is a traditional Greek workshop. So there are only actually 3 true aspects, as defined by being less than 3 degrees apart. The portions of these planets are less than 3 portions apart. So we have the opposition of the Sun with Mars and in the reverse, because they are both at this the 14th degree portion of their images, respective images. When we look at the Moon and Saturn, you see that Saturn is at the 28th portion of the fishes, and the Moon is at the 29th portion of the bull, the 30th portion, I should say. So the Moon is disengaging from Saturn, which is flowing forth. And you see Venus, she still needs to get to the degree where the portion where Saturn Chronos is. So these are the actual 3 aspects happening in our life in this chart. So the rest, all the other things shown by relations between planets in this chart are configurations. They are testimony, and I will address later how they testify to each other, in what way, and how you can express that in a formulation or a delineation for a client. So yeah, these are the trigonals, the diametricals, etc., etc. And a very, very important thing which needs to be addressed is that aspects, applications, and separations can cross boundaries, but configurations cannot. And this actually settles the idea of that you can have out of image, out of sign aspects, etc. Because when you are talking about that, then you're actually talking about aspect, application, and separation. These are two very quite different concepts in this astrology. So whenever you're talking about planets approaching each other within these 3 degrees portions, 3 degrees distances, then you can actually say that this is indeed degree based, and then they are doing something quite different from the idea of the configuration. And then perhaps the configuration issues no longer apply, and then it's simply about planets doing something with each other. I will get back to that further on. Okay, I have a chart of a client of mine, which is an interesting example of this idea of planets approaching each other within certain portions, which we now call an orb, and they cross borders. So here you can see that Mercury is approaching the sun, and they are within the 3 portions distance of each other. So this is an aspect and not a configuration. So there's something different going on. And you can say, of course, Mercury is burnt by the sun, but perhaps you can say some different things about this configuration, because it's an application and it's an aspect proper, and it's not a configuration. So they do not testify to each other, but one planet is doing something with the other planet, and that I will further on address the idea of maltreatment and bonification, but this is a good example of it. So please remember that application and separation of aspects proper is about the planets and not the images. And that's the big difference between these two. So it's not testimony, it's engagement, as it is within 3 portions. So it's either bonification or maltreatment. Again, I will address maltreatment later on, and I'll get back on this issue, etc. You can also see that the moon is on her way to Mars, because the moon can never be retrograde, so she's always moving forward in any image she is in, and she's in close contact with Mars, but it's further away than the 3 portions needed for it being called an aspect. But there's a difference. The moon's daily speed is on average 12 or 13 portions approximately. So therefore the orb of application and separation for the moon for Selene is 12 portions, or some say 13. I actually prefer 13 degrees. So yes, this is an aspect. So yeah, again, it's not testimony, but it's an engagement. The moon is engaging Mars. So these are the orbs for the moon. So again, to recapitulate, aspect propers are whenever planets are within 3 portions, applying or separating, which is 7 portions in totals. And you see here the difference between, for instance, Jupiter at 23 degrees of the twins, and Saturn being at 21 degrees of the fishes. So these 2 planets have a contact, and this one is separating, but it's still within the 3 degree range, 3 portion range. And for the moon, it's 12 to 13 portions. So you can also see a sextile, a hexagonal configuration about to apply to the moon and Venus, because the moon will, when you add 13 degrees to the 5 degrees of the moon, you come to 18. So this is an applying hexagonal figure with Venus. So that's interesting. So it's interesting because this really illustrates what happened in the life of this woman. So I will relate this now. This is my client, and this connection between Mercury and the Sun is called a collasis, a gluing together, when, this is the definition, whenever a star, the faster one, approaches the slower one, being not more apart from it than 3 portions. Okay, so that's what's going on. It's an adherence, and it is a maltreatment whenever one of them is a malefic. And this is also the case for the moon and Ares Mars. So this is what she said. I'm from a very intellectual family. My father was in academia, and he's a veritable walking encyclopedia on all difficult topics of history, language, geography, etc. My 4-year-old brother is also an intellectual. My 6-year-old sister has a PhD. My mother studied and taught French. So Mars rules the 4th place and is located in the 9th place, which is a very interesting take on what she described here. Okay, the family of my father, the father is the 4th, but also the 9th, according to Vetches Valens, is very intellectual, and they all have interesting and high-level jobs at UNICEF, UNESCO, in ministries, the World Bank, etc. And they all write books. So, wow, that's pretty interesting. Now, the case was that at home as a child, she was I believe she was the youngest. The conversation at the kitchen table was, in my experience, always about difficult topics that I did not participate in. In fact, I was never asked anything. So about what I thought about a particular topic either. So they didn't think I could have any significant input. And in fact, I didn't have any. And usually after about 5 minutes, I wandered off and lose the thread of the conversation and wander off in thought, off into my own world. Again, here you see a maltreatment condition. And how do we define this? You can say that Mercury maltreats the Sun, who is Lord of the Ascendant, the rising image representing my client in person. So you can say that Mercury is maltreating her, and what is being maltreated? Her intelligence. So the intelligence of the family members is actually maltreating her as a person. Because she said, to this day, I lag behind in that kind of knowledge. And that has had an influence on my self-image that originated in that period. I'm stupid. I'm not an interesting conversation partner. I have little to contribute, etc. So strangely enough, this led me to preferring environments where I'm intellectually challenged and where people generally know more about things than I do. So here we have quite an interesting example of how this maltreatment can function whenever planets are really in the distance of 3 portions with each other. That's, again, that is a different concept from the idea of testimony. So please have that, take that into account, and I will address the issue of what the difference is between assuming a figure and engaging in a figure. Oh, which I will be doing now in my order of topics. So let's have a look at them. So when you're talking about whole sign house-based configuration, which are called testimony, you're actually talking about assuming a figure. And these are interesting pictures about what assuming a figure is. You can see it in all sorts of martial arts movies. You can see it in dances where both the partners are inviting each other to engage in a figure, but they are not yet engaged in a figure. They are simply assuming one. And again, as you can see in these pictures, they can be hostile, they can be friendly, they can be very supportive, but you can have a whistle at somebody, a wolf whistle, I believe it's called in America, which is either very nice to have or really an affront. So yeah, these configurations can be either good or bad. It's what Schmidt called a stance. It's sort of a posture of one planet, a posture towards another one. Is it a friendly posture or is it a hostile posture? Do I like this or don't I like this? So, and there's a big difference with engaging in a figure, because when we're talking about dancing, then the partners grab each other and they start dancing. And when we're talking about martial arts, then the fight is really on. So that's aspects proper within 3 portions. And that's the reason why engaging in a figure is actually about maltreatment or bonification. So that's the great difference between them. And again, here you see the difference. The one is a look, a stance, a posture, and the other one is really engaging. So that's a very interesting difference. And please take that into account. That's the big difference between planets approaching each other, which is a stance, a posture, and when they are really engaging with each other, then they're actually doing something to each other. It's almost physical. So let's get physical. That's what engaging in a figure actually is about. So, okay. Okay, let's talk about testimony for a minute. Testimony, again, it's, sorry to keep repeating myself, it's assuming a whole sign configuration, expressing something favorable or unfavorable, about the planet, which the other one in the configuration. It's a stance, an attitude, and again, it goes both ways. It's not about one planet doing something to the other one, because that's engagement. And in the legal paradigm, I will address this in a minute, testimony is either a yes in favor or a no. As I said, when you are a witness, you can say something about what you saw. And the interesting thing is that the word aspect really means looking at and seeing. So that's really a very important concept behind the idea of configuration and aspects. Looking at, seeing, being witness to, etc., etc. And Schmidt made a lot of mention of the legal paradigm, which then has to do with planets seeing one another, also talking about each other. They have an opinion about each other. And then one planet can say, well, I like this to be the case for this person. And the other one will say, no, I wouldn't agree. I will not have this for this person. So I will not go into the legal paradigm in depth. That would be a completely different webinar, I think. But the interesting thing is that astrology is about making judgments based on evidence. It is judicial astrology. Isn't that what we're doing as astrologers? We are trying to find reasons why we can say this about a certain placement in a chart, etc. So the chart delineation is sort of a courtroom drama where one planet is making a plea. I would like to have this be the case for this native, and then there are the lawyers, and one says yes, this is a very good plea, and the other one, the opposition, says no, this cannot be, etc., etc. And that's also a very interesting concept to try to use whenever you are judging aspects and configurations between planets, but that's a different story. So yeah, this is actually about witnessing. So yeah, the idea of seeing, looking has to do with being able to witness something. And that is the reason why planets in inversion cannot look upon each other. So they cannot see each other. So they cannot testify to each other. And that's the reason why the inversions are quite a difficult issue in ancient astrology. So there you have the basis for it. Okay, so again, here's the chart of Frida Kahlo again. These are the planets having testimony to each other. And I took out the planets really configured and being engaging with each other. And I will use her chart as an example for how this functions. So before I go into that, I need to address the idea of maltreatment. Why? Because, as I said before, configurations are about testimony, and aspects are, and when they are within 3 portions, then we are talking about engagement. And certain conditions are maltreatment conditions, and the opposite of the maltreatment conditions is called bonification. I will not list the bonifications significators, simply because they were not mentioned in the text, but you can infer them from what I will be showing now. So let's first look at the word maltreatment. Kakosis from kakao has all sorts of significations in Greek language, which is to distress, to trouble, to injure, to oppress, to suppress, etc. And as a legal term, kakosis especially means misgovernment. And the reason why this is so important and such important doctrine is because it really specifies the sort of affliction that the things that I will enumerate now really indicate. And nowadays we talk about afflictions in modern astrology afflictions is generally reserved for conjunctions and squares and oppositions with both malefics, but it's hardly ever defined what it actually then means, in the sense, what is that planet doing? Is it distressing the planet afflicted? Is it troubling the planet afflicted? Does it injure the planet? Does it oppress the planet? Which are all quite different things happening to a planet. So the definition of maltreatment is much more subtle than the simple idea of, well, there's an affliction, which means it doesn't function that well. Yeah, but why doesn't it function that well? Is it distressed? Is it in trouble? Is it injured, etc., etc.? Which makes this again a very interesting definition in his book, his Major Opus. So let's have a look what this is. So again, we are engaging in a figure. It's either a bonification or a maltreatment condition. So when you talk about bonifications, you can say planet A is petting and stroking or kissing planet B, and maltreatment is more slapping, striking, or hitting planet B. So that's quite a difference. So what are these conditions? I will simply enumerate them here, and you can investigate them for whatever charts you want to investigate. I will show an example now. Again, there are 8 conditions, and which is much more, and again, much more subtle than simply saying this planet is afflicted, because you need to define what kind of affliction is actually going on for a planet. So let's have a look at the example that I wanted to show you. Oh yeah, there's one thing I need to address when people are not familiar with this, this definition. That has to do with overcoming. And here we have 2 examples of overcoming. The simplest way is to say you number the places where the planets are that are configured, and you start with one planet, and then, for instance, here I do it with Venus, and then you can see when you count the images from Venus to Saturn, Kronos, who is actually aspecting in aspect with Venus, then you can see that Saturn is coming from the 10th place to Venus. So that's an affliction in the sense that Saturn is coming down upon Venus. And it's also the case for the moon, because when I start counting the moon as number 1, the place where she is, and then I go around the circle, you can see that Saturn is in the 11th place relative to the location of Selene, the moon. So that is also called coming down upon. So when you're not familiar with this, study this image, and then hopefully you can find it out for whatever chart you want to investigate. So here it is. It's it's definition number 6, overcome by a poorly situated destructive star, which is the case for the Saturn that I just showed you, because it's in the 8th place. That's a poorly situated destructive star. It's Saturn, which is a malefic. It's in the 8th place in this chart. I will show you again in a minute. And it's overcoming the moon and also Venus. So, okay, let's have a look. Here you can see, again, the true aspects. So there's something happening because these planets are engaged with each other. So Venus is approaching Saturn. So this is still very much in the making, sort of. And the moon is leaving the conjunction, again, the conjunction, that the position relative to Saturn. And you can see that Mars and the moon, the Mars and the Sun, Helios, and Aries are really in an exact opposition with each other. So you can see this as the following. The Sun is sort of bonifying Mars because the Sun is a benefic, sort of. And Mars is, of course, a malefic, maltreating the Sun. That is the aspect that I will be addressing in the case of Frida Kahlo. When you look at the moon sextile Mars, the moon and Saturn are sort of bonifying each other. Why? Because they are in a hexagonal aspect with each other. But again, Saturn is in superior position to the moon, and he is coming down upon the moon from a place not conducive to business, which is the 8th place. So there's also a sort of maltreatment going on. And again, we have the same thing going on with Venus and Saturn. Perhaps you can say that Venus sort of bonifies Saturn, but you can also say that Saturn maltreats Venus and is in superior position to Venus. Okay, let's have a look at the maltreatment conditions in this chart. Again, I enumerated the maltreatment conditions here, 1 to 8. Let's have a look how these are found in the chart of Frida Kahlo. So here you see the opposition between Helios and Aries, diametrically opposed. That's one. Venus is overcome by a poorly situated destructive star. When you look at Mars, Mars himself has a poorly situated star as its domicile master because Saturn is in the 8th place, which means that is poorly situated. And then again, you have the 8th condition when it's itself declining in places not conducive to business. Now, this is harmful for Mars and less harmful for Helios and Zeus, Jupiter. And the reason is that the domicile master of Helios and Jupiter is the moon. And she's in a very beneficent place. And she's also in her own image of exaltation, which is the bull. So this is a bonification condition for the Sun and Jupiter, but you can see that Mars is really not in that condition because the domicile master of Aries is Saturn, which is placed in the 8th place. So you can say that the Sun and Jupiter are relieved perhaps from this malefic position, but Mars is heavily into it. So yeah, let's see what has happened. Let's have a look at this Mars in the 6th place. And first, let's take inventory. You can see that Mars is retrograde. You see the dates. 1 month, about 1 month before she was born, it moved retrograde. Interesting thing is that retrogradation is not mentioned as a malefic, as a maltreatment condition, but it's, well, it's something, right? So, and then we have the fact that Mars is maltreated. As I said, Saturn in the 8th place, poorly situated star as its domicile master, and Mars is declining in a place not conducive to business. So yeah, this is a difficult position of Mars. So what we see here is indeed an engagement and not testimony. She, because the Sun represents as ruler of the 1st place her body, her mind, Vita corpus ingenium, as Zoller always called the ascendant, the significations of the ascendant, the rising image. So her body, her mind, and she herself is maltreated, or perhaps actually harmed. We might even say damaged by Mars, as this is a proper aspect within 3 portions. Maltreatment of the Sun's significations as representing the ascendant, she herself. Now, Valens said, if benefics, Sun for instance, are maltreated by malefics, then their functioning is weakened, suppressed or limited. And if malefics are maltreated by malefics, so in this case, perhaps Mars being maltreated by the Saturn, they respond with violence. So let's have a look. Perhaps you know about what happened to Frida Kahlo, so let's have a look at that. But first, I want to address an issue that is very interesting with regards to Hellenistic astrology, the 6th place. When you read the booklets of Valens, it's interesting that he really says that indeed the 6th place gives signs for injuries, but in his procedure for determine physical illness and injury, he never mentions the 6th place. And for that topic, Valens only uses the lots of fortune and a lot of spirit, and that's odd. So the question is, what's that all about? So what does that mean? And when we read the things that Valens actually writes about planets in the 6th place, you can see that he's actually not talking about diseases at all, So for instance, when somebody has the sun in the 6th place, he doesn't mention that somebody could have a heart failure or something having to do with backache or back pain or whatever. He talks about something else. I will show you. So it's more about the 6th place is the place of Kaketuge, which means bad luck, having bad fortune with this planet. So whenever he finds a planet in the 6th place, this is what he says about him. So let's first have a look at the Benefics. He says when the Benefics should happen to be in this place, whatever the nativity should acquire, he will waste, and property will not remain with him. And after advancing in youth, he will be reduced by fines in old age. And what this actually says is that the goods of the Benefics gets injured, kaketuge, which means bad fortune, bad luck with whatever the Benefics produce. So another example, the sun. So when the sun is present in the 6th place, and has authority over the lot of fortune or the hour, which is not always the case, he causes the native to be condemned by a great power. Great power is, of course, the sun. So the native is possibly injured by the sun, or i.e. has bad luck, kaketuge, with persons in authority. That's quite a different take on this 6th place. When Cronus is so situated, you can read it for yourself. It's interesting. The star of Aphrodite, you have bad luck or a misery around the topics of Venus, being love, etc., women, you name it. And only when it comes to the star of Aries, it produces injury and suffering corresponding to the member of the zodiac, but it makes foot soldiers, beggars, etc., who have their lives turned around for ill. So the interesting thing is that Mars is the only planet rejoicing in the 6th place. And only Aries is mentioned as producing physical injuries because that is one of his universal significations, as is the case, for instance, when he talks about the sun being present there. The universal significations are can be or might be a topic having to do with where you have bad luck with sun's significations. So that's interesting. But in this case, we have something different going on. So let's have a look at the chart of Frida. Now, as I said before, we have the Hellenistic delineation principles. A planet signifies something or is doing something, and then we are talking in this case about Mars. And the question is, with what is the planet doing something? And that's with its dispositor, which is, in this case, Saturn. Saturn, Cronus being the dispositor of Aries Mars. So what does that mean? Now, Schmidt always said that let me show you. This is the question of the guest-host relation, where the host, which is the domicile master of a certain planet, being a visitor in a certain image, in this case, Mars being the guest in the domicile of belonging to Saturn. And Saturn, the domicile master, is not sort of an authority figure, but much more a host. He has to provide for the guest. So the question is, what does Saturn, as domicile master of Mars, being a good host, Saturn, provide for Mars to hurt, to injure, or wound? Because that is something that Mars can do, especially when he's in a strong condition like this one. So let's have a look. Now, when Kahlo was 6 years old, she contracted polio, which made her right legs, Capricorn, shorter and thinner than her left leg. And her parents didn't notice this. Not noticing something has to do with Saturn. I did not know about this until her right leg visibly shriveled, and for 9 months she was bedridden with much pain. There we have Mars being intense by being in his own degrees his exaltation. This illness forced her to be isolated from her peers for months, and she was bullied also because she was crippled, of course. The experience made her a reclusive, and due to the polio, she began her school career much later than her peers. And you can see that Mars rules the 9th place of education. So it has all sorts of ramifications having to do with the fact that Saturn is the domicile master of Mars, and Mars is doing things to this Saturnine principle. Saturn is providing material for Mars to hurt. Okay. She later described the atmosphere in her childhood home as often as very sad. And of course, Mars rules the 4th place in this chart. You can see it not here, but in the other picture of her chart. So, but this is the major event that happened to her on 17th of September 25. You can read about this later, but what happened was that the streetcar, the bus that they boarded, she and her friend crashed into a streetcar, and Kahlo was actually impaled with an iron handrail that went through her pelvis. And she later described this injury as the way a sword pierces a bull, which is very heavy. Of course, it was a very, very heavy accident, and she suffered many, many injuries. Her pelvic bone was fractured, her abdomen and uterus had been punctured by the rail. Her spine was broken in no less than 3 places. Her right leg was broken in no less than 11 places. Her right foot was crushed and dislocated. Her collarbone was broken and her shoulder was dislocated. So yeah, you can see here that Saturn provides material for Mars to hurt, which is Saturn, of course, rules the skeleton. So yeah, you can see that many bones were harmed by this and injured by this accident. Now, etc. She was very heavily wounded, and people thought they would not live, but she survived. So that's also very interesting. There is testimony to that. Okay, now there is a very long list of the enormous physical and psychological impact of this accident on her life. So again, I will not read them all off, but she had to wear plastic corsets, about 28 of them during her life between 1914 and 54, which is almost simply 14 years, and then having to wear 28 of these corsets. She had 3 miscarriages. She could not have children. She was in a lot of pain constantly. Her right foot was amputated in 1934, and also she had a very big, as you can see in the first image on the left-hand side, a metal plate was inserted into her spine together with a piece of bone from her pelvis, etc. She also represented that in her pictures. And in August 53, her right lower leg was amputated, and that was really the final blow to her. She never got over that, and she said that she was disintegrating. And after that, after her last exhibition, she attempted suicide several times with medication, and she succeeded in 1954. So yeah, you can say in a certain sense that she was something who had her life turned around for ill. This is, of course, not always the case for people having Mars in the 6th place, but in this case it was, and it has a lot to do with the opposition between Mars and the ruler of the 1st place, being the Sun. And this is again an exact configuration, so they are maltreating each other, mishandling each other. Okay, so what about the testimony, the witnesses? Well, of course, we can see here that aside from the opposition, we have a opposition with Jupiter, of course, and this is not within the appropriate range. The Mars is, of course, separating from this configuration because Mars is retrograde. So there is this is testimony and not maltreatment or whatever. So this is where you can try to practice formulating it in this way. So Jupiter bears witness to whatever Mars is doing or whatever Mars has accomplished. And the interesting thing is that she survived, which is a Jupiter signification, I think. But she could never give birth, and Jupiter is, of course, also a planet having to do with children. And in her case, it's also the ruler of the 5th place, but it's in inversion, so that there are 2 possible significations of not being able to bear children. So you can again say being childless is testimony of or testifies to the affliction of Mars. That's the way you can try to formulate that, which of course gives great depth in when you describe somebody's life, of course. Now, then you have the very interesting trine trigonal configuration between the moon and Mars, which is a trine, of course. The moon is in the 10th and has to do with her life path. So her career, so her way through life testifies to the suffering produced by Mars. And how is that done? By means of a trine. So it's also an easy way of going about that. It's a testimony. So yeah, the moon says something about Mars and Mars says something about the moon. So she was an accomplished artist, painter, often portraying her pain and suffering. She was famous and appreciated. The moon is, of course, in her own exaltation together with the MC, so that's interesting. But also, of course, moon is the ruler of the 12th place in the 10th, so you can say that her life path is admitting of much suffering, 12th place, to which her art, the moon, ruled by Venus, and her health and the accident Mars testifies. So again, here you have another way of trying to formulate what is happening with this witnessing. So here you see some examples of this idea of how she suffered indeed, the pain and the blood and all the operations and whatnot. So that's quite a thing. Here again, another, she really saw herself perhaps as no longer a human being, but somebody who was really shored up by all sorts of applications and trying to stay upright by means of all sorts of contraptions. Okay, now Mars is of course retrograde, sextile, Saturn separating configuration, which is testimony. And again, if malefics are maltreated by malefics, which is the case for Mars and Saturn, they respond with violence. Think again about the heaviness of the accident and the wounds that she suffered from that accident, which was pretty violent. Yeah. Okay. I want to show something else which is very interesting in this example, because one of the other principles of delineation Hellenistically is asking when is the planet doing this. That has to do with timing. And that's a very interesting example, Kahlo is, as I will show you now, but it's not always such an easy, such a crisp and clear example, but in this case it is, because when the accident happened in 1925, she was 18 years of age, which is her 19th year. And some of you perhaps know that the sun, the minor period of the sun, is 19 years. So, and that period ends when you are 18 years of age, because your 18th birthday signifies the start of your 19th year. So that's interesting, but what's more interesting is that you can see here the maltreatment of the sun and the bonification by the sun, perhaps for Mars. And valence often implies that as to timing, these periods last for this number of years. And they manifest in something happening when the period ends. So that's again a different take on what planets are doing whenever they are in aspect. But the interesting thing is that when one of the periods of a planet ends, then you see an event happening. That's actually the core of this doctrine, which is very interesting. Pythagoras says something also very interesting regarding to the diameters, the oppositions of malefics. They are difficult, but benefics are never bad. That's something to remember. Neither one diametrical to each other nor to the lights. But in this case, we have, of course, Mars being a malefic, because this is a day chart and Mars is the malefic of the night sect. So, and he also says that Cronus and Ares are exceedingly malefic in this figure if they have the action while stationing. Now, Mars is not stationing, he's retrograde, but in other literature, that's often portrayed as a planet standing still. But okay, I'm not quite sure if this goes here, but that's very interesting. So what you see here, that is in her 19th year, the sun, the period of Helios, ends perhaps his protection and perhaps also from Mars, and then the accident happens. So that's really an interesting example, I think. Okay, now I come to the last portion of my webinar, That has to do with something that Schmidt found in a text from Anubio, and that has to do with configuration selecting certain signification of planets. And I also have an example of that, which is, I think, is very interesting. Okay, so this is what Anubio said in his treatment of aspects. So he gave a delineation, and then he made this remark, and that was a delineation about Saturn being aspected by Zeus. So this is what he said. I will read it off for you. These delineations hold, provided that the planet testified to has authority or lordship over the topic, just as is the case when Kronos is in its own domicile. And I add, that's something Anubio also said as a second condition, or Saturn is ruling the 11th place when it has the rulership over the topic of friendship. Then it signifies friendship and trusteeship. By being in its own dignities, the planet can and will realize some of its own universal significations. That's interesting to know. But then he says, and that's the punchline, not always, but only when seen or testified to by Zeus. So whenever Saturn is ruling the 11th place or is in his own domicile, he might signify friendship and trusteeship, but only when seen to or testified by Zeus, because Zeus is also a planet having to do with friendship and honors. So you see, there's something going on with selecting something from another planet, the planet that is testified to by the other planet. So let me again state this for you. So if Kronos, Saturn, is in its own domicile of the goat-horned one or the water power, and I guess it might also be when it's in the scales in Libra, and perhaps even in its own bounds, but I'm not quite sure about that. It can produce a whole variety of delineations and issues in conformity with his natural universal significations, such as friendship and trusteeship. But then the planet seeing Kronos select from all his possible significations and topics, specific ones. Remember that. And so there can be several things produced of the natural significations of Kronos, but only the ones brought out in accord with the nature of the testifying planets. So you can sort of say that there is a selection going on whenever planets are testifying to each other, because testifying is always also an interesting word here. When you say that Kronos has to do with friendship, then whenever Jupiter is testifying to Saturn, it brings out sort of the issues having to do with friendship and trusteeship, simply because they are also significations of Jupiter. So he enhances the significations that Kronos has in that condition, in that situation, by being in its own domicile or ruling the 11th place, having to do with friendship and trusteeship. So that's interesting. So that's easy, right? So let's have a good example, because you need to think about this and need to see this, and hopefully I can let you see this in an example. So let's turn to Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has a planet in its own domicile. And whenever this is the case, then testifying planets to that planet in its own domicile are perhaps enhancing things having to do with that planet in domicile. So let's have a look. So here you see, we're going to talk about the sun, Helios. Why? Because it's in its own domicile in the Lion. And then we look at the aspects, the configurations, and you can see that the sun in Leo is seen by Ares Mars via a hexagon, and it's telling testimony. Why is it telling testimony? Because the sun is moving towards the portion where Mars is, and the sun is always faster than Mars. So it's telling testimony because the sun will reach this hexagonal configuration with Aries. Then you see Jupiter. Jupiter is also in a relationship, a tetragonal configuration with the sun, because it's 10. The sun is, when we start counting from Jupiter, then you see that the Sun is in the 10th place relative to Jupiter. So that is a superior position. I will get into that. But you can see that this is also telling testimony, this square aspect, as we would now call it in modern language, is again telling testimony. Why? Because Jupiter is a slow planet and the Sun still has to reach the portion where Jupiter is. So this is telling testimony. So yeah, they will do that. Now, the Sun is also in conjunction in a concourse relationship with Saturn. So they are both traveling in company, which is a very nice way of addressing this. They are traveling in company. Saturn is traveling in company with the Sun, Helios, because they are in the same image. That's a different concept. Okay, we're talking about the selection of principles by planet, in this case aspecting the natural significations of Helios, the Sun. So what do they testify to? What do they bring out of the significations of Helios, the Sun? The principles, the universal significations of the Sun are emphasized by Martian principles. So again, the question is, what does Mars emphasize or bring about for or of the Sun's significations in accord with his own specific Martial significations? That's the question. And when you look at Jupiter, who's always also in a configuration, what of the universal significations of the Sun does Jupiter emphasize or bring about for the Sun in accord with his own specific Jupiterian manners or significations? So let's have a look. First, this is what Valence says about what the significations are of Helios, the Sun, and the planets I put in after each signification is the one that I want to emphasize because of the significations of the aspects or the configurations of these planets with the Sun. So when you talk about kingly office, you can say that has, of course, something to do with Jupiter, and because they are in connection to each other, they testify to each other. Then Jupiter testifies strongly to the kingly office that the Sun normally signifies whenever he's in Leo. It's his own domicile. And hegemony has something to do with Mars being the strongest, being the most forcible person, etc. Height of fortune is, of course, Jupiter. Public registration and action has to do with Mars. Popular leadership has to do with both. Being popular, judgment, the father, mastership, etc., etc. So let's have a look what happened here. So when we are looking at Mars, what does Mars bring about in the significations of the Sun, which are somewhat enhancing whatever the Sun is signifying? And then Dorotheus says, if Mars aspects the Sun from trine, and he compares it sort of with sextile, but it's a bit weaker. And the nativity is nocturnal, which it is. And Mars is the Lord of the hour, which is the Lord of the ascendant, which he is not. Then he will be elevated in the good because sometimes he will be a powerful king. So how does this connect with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Well, it's in this. He was 5 years in a row, he was Mr. Olympia when he was still doing body, how do you call it, weightlifting and such, bodybuilding. And he did it again in 1980, which a lot of people didn't think he could do again, but he did. So yeah, you can say that here, the Mars principle of being a very strong person, or whatever you would like to call it, sculpting the body, which is actually something also having to do with Mercury, which is very close to his ascendant degree. So yeah, that's also something having to do with pumping iron, I guess. So yeah, that's something having to do with Mars, brings out something having to do with the natural signification of the Sun. He was famous for that, very famous for that. And also, which is very strange, perhaps to a lot of people, he was made governor of the state of California, of which Yeah, let's not get into that, but that's an interesting. And of course, in pictures, he was also many times depicted as a very strong and almost invincible person, not able to conquer the strength of Mr. Schwarzenegger. So that's interesting, right? So yeah, you can say that a lot of his personal life and the reason for his fame, whatever happened to him, had a lot to do with this Mars application between the Sun and Mars. So Mars is bringing something about for the Sun. It's selecting something from the significations of Mars, enhancing the significations of the Sun. Okay, so let's have a look at Jupiter in a minute. Again, so these universal significations of the Sun are selected by Mars, brought forth from the Sun by Mars. He, Mars, bears witness to them. So you could also say that the Sun, his fame, is testimony of martial activities, both in real life, being a bodybuilder, and perhaps also in fictional life, being a movie actor. So what does Jupiter perhaps bring about for the Sun? Because again, these are two planets having a configuration with each other. Again, telling testimony, as I said. So what you see here is the all-seeing Sun is significant for all these Jupiterian significations for the Sun, and Jupiter can bring them out simply because he is supplying testimony for that. So he's witnessing to the Sun, and the Sun is testimony of whatever Jupiter is witnessing to. Kingly office, height of fortune, popular leadership, persons of high repute, the honors of images, statues, or crowns of office. Well, he at least had pictures of him posted up everywhere when he was in a very successful Terminator series. So yeah, it was not statues, but it were images. Archpriest, I'm not sure if he's a religious guy. So when you look at this, again, you can see that there is as Dorotheus says it, if Jupiter is in quartile of the Sun, while the Sun is in the 10th sign from Jupiter, which it is, it indicates that his father will be noble. That was not the case, as you can see with Sun conjunct Saturn, which has to do with the father. But his property will diminish and he will rise up from his homeland. Well, Arnold moved to America, where he became very famous, and the people of his city will elevate him. Yeah, he was made governor of California, where he lived. And some of the more powerful of his enemies will be furious with him. And that were perhaps the robots that were after him in the Exterminator series, the later versions of them. So yeah, again, hopefully you can see that this is actually a very interesting principle going on when planets are testifying about another planet, what they can bring about for that planet. Now, the last thing I want to show you has to do with this principle, the Concourse relationship. Again, this is very different because it's not about testimony. They are fellow travelers, which is a different concept altogether. And Serapio says when they are traveling in company with each other, they are co-workers. But those that meet with it, so when they are within these 3 portion distances, then they are called assistants, which is not the case here for Saturn, because that distance is more than 3 portions. So there's not an adherence, that they are further apart at an interval, and not further apart than an interval of 15 portions. So they are co-workers. And perhaps you could say that Arnold is famous because of lifting heavy stuff, which is also has to do with Saturn, perhaps. So they're not assistants, they are fellow travelers. Something to say about his dad is this. According to Schwarzenegger, his parents were very strict because then after World War II, it was a different world, etc., etc. The second one is very interesting because the favoritism of his father for the eldest son, Meinhard, over Arnold had to do with an unfounded suspicion of his dad that Arnold was not his biological child. So that's interesting because the idea of calling into doubt the birthright of a certain person also has to do with Saturn. Saturn is, of course, the person who has not the planet who has nothing of its own, but only takes care of other persons' children, for instance, or the money that other people have, they don't have it themselves. That's typical of Saturn, and this is, of course, a Saturn not in a good place. But the interesting thing is that it was a suspicion that Arnold was not his biological child by the father. So that's a very interesting consideration taken into account for this Saturn being in such a close fellow traveling principle. They are co-workers. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that with relation to its that, but perhaps we should not do that. So, okay. So with this, sorry, I come to the end of my presentation and I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, I apologize because it's long. I did it quite fast, so 1.5 hours, so I'm happy with that. But I apologize for the length and the complexity of this material, simply because I think it must be quite new for some of you, and then it's really an exhausting exercise. But I hope I have achieved what Schmidt always tries to do with his work, which is habit breaking. We learn things from the way we learn astrology, and sometimes these things need to be re-examined, and that's what actually Schmidt was doing a lot about, rethinking the concepts. So yeah, that's an important thing, and I hope I've done him justice with this presentation, and I hope that you will benefit from it in all of your studies. And Delia will, of course, tell you that this video can be revisited on the channel of Acyuta, but also on my own YouTube channel, available for further study. So thank you for listening and your patience, because this was a fast talk about heavy stuff. And thank you, Acyuta, for making this webinar possible. And thank you, Delia, for your kind assistance again, as always. And whenever there are questions, you can ask them now, of course, but you can also email me. So yeah, that's it. This is my video channel. Please visit it, because there are many more videos about things I did. And this started off with the first webinar I was allowed to do for Acyuta, which was the first one, the 7 hermetic lots, the conceptual model as inspired by Robert Schmidt. So yeah, whenever you want to delve deep into this material, please visit these videos, and yeah, you can see for yourself how important all this work is, and I really enjoy doing it. So a little bit of promotion. You can study, I can do chart readings, of course. Well, you can read that later in the video, and here is a testimonial to what I do whenever I do a chart. So thanks again, and I think there might be questions. So I'll stop sharing, and then we go to Delia. Thank you.
Thank you, Martien. That was fabulous. And I'm quite impressed that you managed to pack all of that into an hour and a half.
Yeah, so
very impressive.
People need to revisit the video, I think, because it was all fast work. So yeah.
Yes, your talks are always ones that I always want to go through and digest bit by bit and really get it into me. Yes, yeah, so thank you for making those available as well. And I just want to say, I particularly enjoyed the example with Frida Kahlo. Her house is just about 25 minutes away from where I live.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The Casa Azul.
Exactly,
the Casa Azul. Yeah. Wow, great.
So it was really nice to get a different astrological perspective on that.
Did you know about the severity of her accident?
Not to the degree in which you explained it today. I was quite taken aback. Okay. It was a great chart example.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. And
all
Arnold,
right.
of course. Yeah.
Also a great example.
Quite a different example.
Yes. It's funny about, you had an example of somebody's body breaking down and then an example of somebody who built their body up.
Right, yeah. Oh, I didn't even realize that, but yeah, I didn't do that on purpose, but yeah, now you mention it, it's typical, right?
Yeah, it's nice. All right, so we do have some questions in the Q&A box. So what would the signification be if Saturn and the Sun are in adherence less than 3 degrees conjunction?
Yeah, that would mean that the Sun is maltreating Saturn, because that's the only way in this that this can function. So whatever the Sun signifies is hurting Saturn. So then you need to go deeper into the chart and try to understand what Saturn is representing. So then you have something, the Sun's significations are hurting Saturn. So Schmidt said that it was sort of like a monkey on your back. That is how it feels to have a planet that is always somehow maltreating you, or your monkey on your back. You are sort of, it's difficult to get rid of it, because that's the principle that is really afflicting you. Think of the example I used of the woman who had Mercury maltreating the Sun, ruling her first place. The intellectual capacity of her family was actually harming her, and she was still, I'm not sure how much she was struggling with it at the moment, but it's really something that accompanied her throughout her life up until now. She never felt quite safe. Oh, I'm not that intellectual. I'm not a fascinating or interesting conversation partner. So Mercury is really maltreating her. And something is of the sort is going on with the Sun and Saturn when they are within the 3-portion range. And that, again, you have to understand who or what is the Sun signifying, and who or what is Saturn signifying. And there the crux of the difficulty lies.
We actually had a couple of questions about that chart.
See, very, very good. From Hannah McAllister, it's now gone. She said something very nice.
Yes, the comment is that Frida was terminated and Arnold was the Terminator, both Mars symbolism.
Right. Again, I didn't know, and really sharp observation. Really good. Thank you. I like that.
So there were a couple of questions about the chart where Mercury is maltreating the Sun.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, why is Mercury a malefic here, or why is Mercury maltreating the Sun? And if you want to bring the chart up, you can also share again if you want.
Okay, well, that's actually quite a simple statement. This has to do with a condition that is called maltreatment. So whenever you find any planet which is the faster one moving towards a slower one, which is in the case with the Sun, Mercury approaching the Sun, then whenever you have this sort of situation, you must say that the faster one is maltreating the slower one. So in this example, it was Mercury maltreating the Sun. And that's the reason why I mentioned that it might be that the idea of combustion, which was of course the case in this example, Mercury was way too close to the Sun to be seen, but this is perhaps a different concept having to do with what Schmidt called the maltreatment conditions. So whenever planets are 3 degrees apart from each other, and the faster one is approaching the slower one, then we have a case of maltreatment. So whatever planet it is, Mercury can maltreat the Sun, as was, in my idea, very clear in this example.
This is a question from the Q&A box. So a benefic can maltreat too?
No, that's an interesting. It's good that you asked this. The interesting thing is that in Definitions and Foundations, the book I mentioned about Schmidt, the first thing that's interesting is the numerical punning, what was going on in these definitions, because they all had numbers, except the one of maltreatment, which is sort of a textual maltreatment of this definition. It has no number. That's interesting. The second thing is that the bonification is never defined. It's simply up to the reader to try to understand what is happening with this principle of bonification. So in this case, the question was asked, can a benefic maltreat? Well, actually, when a benefic is within a 3 degree adherence with another planet, then it's a bonification. So you need to sort of reverse, perhaps, change the word malefic in the definition that I gave of concourses, you have to rewrite that. You have to replace the word malefic with benefic, and then you have a bonification condition. And that planet is actually helping. So it's not a monkey on your back or a very nice monkey on your back, because it's helping you. It's not a monkey on your back, it's a cute little bear or something.
A butterfly on your back.
A butterfly, yeah, it's not heavy, indeed. Yeah, it's a good example.
Another question, does maltreatment happen only with aspects or with configurations as well?
No, that's a good question again. Schmidt really emphasized the idea maltreatment can only happen with aspects and not in configurations. But in configurations, you have the situation where one planet can be looking upon another one with, well, threatening or saying something, I don't like you, or the idea of I'm actually saying no to this planet. I don't want this planet to be successful or something. But that's merely an opinion of planet A for planet B, and planet B to planet A. It's interchanged, right? So this is what they think about each other. And that might, of course, induce problems in somebody's life, but not in the sense of a really engagement as in maltreatment or bonification conditions. That's the reason why this is such a different concept.
Another question, and is this maltreatment possible in all aspects or just with co-presence?
No, there are the definitions that I gave were all maltreatment conditions. So when you have a planet having a domicile master in one of the bad places, which is, for instance, the 12th place or the 6th place, and perhaps another one, but these two are the most difficult ones. That's also an indication of being maltreated, because one of the definitions I gave was that in government, it's called not effective rulership. It's not an effective way of handling business. And the other locations of planets in houses are called conducive to business. So the 12th and the 6th place are not conducive to business, and the 8th place, again, also not conducive to business, which was the example in Frida Kahlo, where Mars is disposited by a planet, Saturn being a bad planet, located in the 8th place without any dignity. So, yeah, so there are, study the idea of maltreatment, because there are 8 conditions of them, but there are also 8 conditions of bonification.
All right, and so the next question is, if Mars is in earlier zodiacal order than the Sun, then isn't Mars in an overcoming aspect and therefore maltreating the Sun? I thought Martien said it was the other way around, although my apologies if I misunderstood Martien.
Is this about a conjunction in the same image?
If Mars is in earlier zodiacal order than the Sun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a situation of overcoming. So when we have Mars, for instance, in the Bull, and the Sun being 3 images further, then this is a situation of overcoming. Yes. What you can do to find this out, place one planet, turn it as if it's on the ascendant, and whenever the other planet is in the 10th or the 11th place, then you have a situation of overcoming. Yep.
And the second question from this person, if the moon is in an adherence to Venus, does that mean that the moon is maltreating Venus? And I think this relates to what you said earlier about benefics, is that correct?
Yeah, this is a maltreatment situation. Yep.
It is maltreatment. Okay,
yep.
Thank you. Christina says, love the talk. Earlier, Martien, Earlier, Martien had used the word reach when describing planets coming into contact with each other. And I'd love if he could talk more about that. Is the concept that planets are reaching for each other applicable to our interpretations?
Well, I think that's an interesting idea. It was not what I suggested with that term, it had to do with planet perfecting. That's the Renaissance word for planets actually coming into an exact configuration by portion, a degree based, but reaching for each other. Yeah, could be. I think that's an interesting take on it. Yeah, yeah.
I just got a call from Acyuta, and he said that he is really looking forward to catching up on the talk later and sends his greetings.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Is there a way to make a severe maltreatment better, or how do you consult on this?
What I usually look for is trigonal configurations with the planets that are in this maltreatment condition. So because help can come from this planet. So, and the best one is Jupiter, of course, because Jupiter heals all sorts of misery. As you could see in Frida Kahlo's chart, she survived. It could be that a lot of people might have died with all these sorts of injuries that she had, but she didn't. She survived, and that's a testimony of Jupiter. So yeah, whatever planet is able to have a good relation with a planet that is maltreated, that is a possible escape for the maltreatment. Yet the maltreatment will be a fact of life. So, for instance, the person that I mentioned that had a lot of youth memories about being, sort of left out in the intellectual conversation going on, that really happened. So, you can try to find ways of trying to get behind that or past that, or get into contact with more positive things in your life. Yeah.
The next question is, am I correct in conceptualizing planets that give testimony as being biased in what they testify to, depending on their own natural significations?
Yes, I think that would be a reasonable assumption, yeah. Because each planet has a certain signification and a certain meaning in a chart. And that's might have something to do with the way it approaches other planets. Yes. Yep.
And is the moon in adherence only within 3 degrees or 13?
That's a good question. I'm always a bit in doubt of that. So an adherence is really within 3 portions. But again, for the moon, there's always this larger orb allowed. I'm not definitely sure on that. So for safety, I take the distance of 3 degrees, 3 portions. But depending on the condition of the moon, I sometimes take a larger orb, because suppose the moon is a ruler of the 12th place. When she is moving towards another planet, then I'm very sure that this was going to be a maltreatment of sorts, because the moon represents the 12th place, and then she has sort of a burden with her for that other planet. Yeah, good question. Whenever I doubt something, it's a good question.
For sure. The other courses of which Martien spoke, can they be accessed through his YouTube channel?
The other videos that I showed? Yeah, yes, they are all there. Yeah, yep.
And you can also find Martien's website,
yes,
linked to in the Nightlight events page. You can go and check all of that out there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if Saturn is in Aries in the 6th place in its joy,
Mm-hmm.
and an aspect to Jupiter in the 10th, is this a mitigating factor?
There's one thing not completely correct, because Saturn is in Aries in the 6th place. It is not in its joy.
That's right.
Saturn is only in its joy in the 12th place. So, well, what's very helpful here is that the fact that Jupiter is in the 10th place, because that's a more powerful place than the 6th place. So that is very good for everything in life. Saturn being in the 6th place, being in superior position is sort of coming down to the 10th place. Might be a factor having to do with stuff happening from the 6th place, having to do with this person's life. But Jupiter is a strong mitigating factor because it's in the 10th place. And whenever, I know that Bonatti once said, there's an aphorism of his, he said, whatever happens in somebody's life, whenever you have Jupiter in an angle, it'll be fine. So.
That's reassuring.
Yeah, it is.
Can you comment on Moon Saturn within 3 degrees of each other? The Moon is faster, so is it soothing Saturn or is Saturn corrupting?
Are they approaching each other? That's very important. Is it because when when it's moving away, then we have disengagement, then we have flowing forth, and that's quite a difference because I didn't mention it in my talk because I had a lot to tell. But Schmidt said that whenever planets are moving away from a slower planet, you could say that the planet that is moving away is tainted by the contact it just had. For instance, when you are in contact with a person that smells very nice, might be that you have something of that odor with yourself when you have embraced this person and then move on. Or the other case is when you have embraced a farmer who is just shoveling, the stuff out of the barn, then you might smell of, the S word. So you are sort of tainted with that planet. When you're approaching it, then there's something else going on. And in the case of whenever it's called bonifying or maltreating, it's very important whether or not the moon is a benefic planet, and the lights are often seen as benefic planets. The sun is not, because when the sun is too close, it burns. But the moon, you could say that in general, the moon is a very beneficent planet. So then the moon is trying to support Saturn, trying to do its best for the Saturnine significations. That's what bonification means. It's doing its ultimate best for the native via this planet.
Another question. With the minor periods of planets, do you always count the years from birth?
Yes. But the interesting thing is another webinar, but the interesting thing that Valens did was combining the minor periods of the planets when they are in aspect. So for instance, the moon has 25 years and Venus has 8 years. And when these two are having a relation to each other, then you count up these periods. 25 plus 8 is 33. If I'm not mistaken. So that would mean that in the when you are 32 years of age, which is your 33rd year, then something happens with that has the nature of the Venus-Moon contact. A very interesting principle. But yes, you can use the starting from birth for each planet, using the combination with another planet, but you can also use the periods of both planets together to find another year when something might happen having to do with these two planets. Yeah.
Regarding what you said earlier in your talk about an event happening at the conclusion of a planet's planetary period, does that go for every planet according to their own position in the birth chart, or only when there is an aspect or configuration to another planet?
Again, this is also quite interesting because Valens also uses the ascensional times of the images where a planet is found. So for instance, you have Venus in Aries, then you take the ascensional time of Aries, which is mostly very short, 17 years or so. So when you have Venus there, in the 17th year, when you are 16 years of age, something Venusian-like might happen. So there are all sorts of combinations between planets in aspects, which you can take from the periods of the planets themselves, but you can also count up the ascensional time of the planet and the essential time of the image of the aspecting planet. So there is an enormous heap of possible years in which something might manifest. But the basic one is take the minor year of the planet, try to see if this minor year suggests something, and then you can add all sorts of planets happening or having an aspect or configuration with this planet, and then you have another year, which is also really a very interesting principle of differentiating between when is in, because planets have all sorts of aspects or configurations. And the interesting thing is that you can now have a timing by means of this method of when each of the configurations is actually going to happen. So we have a time frame. Again, a very intelligent design, I think, for astrology.
And what system of planetary periods does Martien use? And does the counting always start from the ruler of the ascendant?
Not necessarily. When you are investigating things from the ascendant, then you take the ascensional time of the rising image, plus the possible planet that is there. You can count them up, you can, etc. Then you can take the ruler of the first place, which also has, of course, a signification for the ascendant. And then his period, the period of that planet, might also come into the scenario. So there are many possibilities. I believe this is addressed in book 4 of Valence, but I'm not quite sure. It could also be book 7. And I think everybody has the Riley translation that is available via PDF on the internet, and you can read up on that there. Yep.
Martien, I want to be very mindful and respectful of your time. We have 2 questions left. Do you have the time to address them still? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So, question. If the sun is traveling with Saturn by 2 degrees, can you explain a bit more about what this adherence means, since it is within that 3-degree range? I'm not quite understanding it yet. Thank you.
So we have to conclude that there is a scenario that the sun is maltreating Saturn. I addressed this earlier, but it's no problem to do it again. So you need to first investigate the natural significations of Saturn and of the sun and try to see whether or not these are conflicting with each other in your life. And then you have to find out what the chart is actually saying about these 2 planets. As I said in the 5 principles of Hellenistic delineation, first after you have established what each planet in its own right signifies, then you have to try to find out which domain of life it represents as a manager, which is the house signification. So whenever the sun is the ruler of the 12th place, then you must see that the 12th place issues are harming Saturn. And so Saturn wants to try to reach a certain goal, and the sun is having trouble with that.
All right, and the last question might be going back a little bit on what was presented earlier in the talk, but it could be a good refresher. What is the orb used for aspects, conjunction, opposition, trine, square, and sextile?
No, none. So when you're really talking about aspects, it is within 3 degrees. So 3 degrees approaching, the faster one approaching, the slower, and when they are moving away from each other, the faster moving away from the slower one, that is also a 3-degree portion. So in total, we're talking about 7 portions, 7 degrees.
Right. Maybe you could say, refresh us on the difference between the concept of orbs versus the engagement.
The orb is simply the difference that must be between 2 planets for them to be engaged. And an adherence is whenever we are talking about really what we now call a conjunction, but a conjunction in the ancient literature was actually about 2 planets approaching each other, so going into an aspect with all the other possible aspects between them. So that might be a sextile, might be a square, etc. Yeah. Okay. Something happened now. Did you stop the... there we are. I'm not hearing you.
Aha, okay,
Yeah.
that's the issue. All right, I'm going to share the Nightlight website so I can point people to where they can find the replay and more of your work. Let me know, are you able to see it on the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So once again, if you go to nightlightastrology.com, events and speaker series, we will post a replay of this talk beginning tomorrow, Monday. It's not posted first thing in the morning. It takes a few hours to go up right here. But if you also want to find out more about Martien's work, you can check out his YouTube channel and his website. So his YouTube channel has a lot of very interesting talks, including your previous talks at Nightlight. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep. I have 3 of them there now. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So that's his YouTube channel, which you can check out and subscribe to. And his website, Martien Hermes, which this is in Dutch. Is that correct?
It's also in English.
And then in English, if you go up here and you click on English, then you can find the English translation, check out his work. You can book a reading with him also, and I'm sure that would be a very worthwhile experience. And with that, we conclude. Please check in with us next week for our talks with Ren Butler on Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time and Jen Zart on next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to point out that if you're outside the US, some clocks might be changing between Saturday and Sunday. So just a reminder to check your local time for Jen Zart's talk. And Martien, thank you so much. This has been wonderful as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And thank you everyone also for being here. And I hope that you all have a lovely rest of your day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.